And I hear a little bit of feedback. I'm not quite sure how to take care of that.
I'll go ahead and mute us and see if that helps.
Okay. So can you hear me okay? If not, just unmute and let me know, because right now it's quite silent.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to sit in my office and talk to you about what I've been learning regarding stress, youth, and obesity. I especially today want to focus in on a few, let's make sure I can move this forward, give you a little bit of a background first on what young people are reporting about their stress and coping, and some impacts of chronic stress on youth behavior, and then look at the connection between stress management, mindful awareness, and the element of, within the element of a youth weight management intervention. And then I'd like to share with you ways that we are teaching stress reduction and mindful awareness practices to students in Orange County. I think we're all, I got a chance to hear who was in the room, and so in many ways I know I'm speaking to the choir regarding whole child health, wellness, and well-being, that it's very short-sighted to think about, and I obviously come from an educational setting at the county office here. We serve 27 school districts and provide trainings in student mental health and stress management and school climate and those factors that hit on the emotional and social development of young people. And so we know that it's pretty short-sighted just to think that we are going to develop the intellectual capacities of young people without realizing that we have to touch on all of these. And the neuroscience is giving us some wonderful evidence that when we focus on cognition, that emotion is right there. It's intertwined. The affect, as one friend of mine said, affect precedes cognition. And so I'm hoping to share some thoughts and maybe some questions with you regarding looking at childhood obesity through the lens of stress and anxiety, and how that may impact behavior and eating habits. Stanford University researchers recently said that we need to really get rid of the cognitive and non-cognitive divide when we're talking about supporting students. It's a rather arbitrary construct. And a little while ago, the Association of Schools, the American Psychological Association conducted its first national survey regarding stress that asked kids, the first time they asked kids questions around stress, and at the same time asked adults' perception of the same items. And it was kind of an interesting insight. So, for example, this was about 1,200 youth in the age 8 to 17-year-old range. And they asked adults, how many kids do you think would rate themselves 8 to 10 regarding feeling stress or perceiving stress on a 10-point scale? About 5% adults said, responded and thought that kids would rate themselves that high. Looking at the tween group, 8 to 12, it was 14%. And then looking at the teen group, it was almost a third of teens who responded. When we think about stress, we need to think about that it's really based on our perception and our reaction to daily life situations. Yes, it triggers physiological impacts of heart rate, higher heart rate, breathing rate, muscle tension, the cortisol flowing through our bodies, et cetera. But a renowned pediatrician, Dr. Edward Taub, says that stress really is between our ears. And it's the perception that what is coming at us, whether it's internal thoughts, worries, or external, is kind of overwhelming our ability to cope. When we looked at physical symptoms associated with stress at the national data, things like headache, stomachache, muscle tensions, adults' perception of what youth would answer would be about 13% of kids may have physical symptoms. The tweens reported nearly a third had some type of physical symptoms, and then teens reported 42%. When we look at sleep issues, and we know that sleep impacts health and impacts cognition, impacts our ability to consolidate our memories, as well as other physiological aspects and could be related to weight. The adults, 13% response, 39% from tweens said that they had some sleep-related issues, and 49% of teens. And I wanted to share a caveat. I am not an expert in obesity. I study stress and the impacts of chronic unmitigated stress on youth, particularly on their learning and their behavior in school and out of school. The same study looked at eating issues, and this is issues regarding eating too much or not eating enough. The adult response, this was the tween response, and the adult perception, and then the teen perspective of 39%. You know, at this point, if I was standing in front of you, I'd ask you what your thoughts are after looking at this data. And most adults say that there's a disconnect between what the adult perspective is and what youth perspective is regarding their responses to these items. A CDC researcher, Dr. Williamson, used ACE data, Adverse Childhood Experience data, to look at the link between child trauma and obesity. And in his study, he found that indeed there is a link between child abuse and obesity in as much as 8% of the youth obese population. When we ask kids how they cope with stress, this comes out of Duke University's Lemmer's Foundation a few years ago, and you can see the stats in front of you, everything from playing or doing something active, which is the preferred, one of the preferred response, and you see quite a few sedentary activities as well, listening to music, watching TV, and then I've highlighted there about a quarter of the students in this study. And let me find my number here. There was, this was almost 1,000 young people in this study said that they would eat something. And we also see some disturbing emotional health issues here of hurting themselves. Going towards teenagers, we're seeing similar patterns among teenagers. Again, you're seeing some sedentary behaviors that they're reporting, and this was the American Psychological Association 2010 report, teens reporting that they turn to sedentary behaviors to make themselves feel better when they're really worried or stressed. And so the breakdown among teens and tweens is listening to music, 36% of tweens, and 66% of teens turn to listening to music when they're feeling anxious. Playing video games, the tweens, that 8 to 12-year-old group, 56% play video games, 41% of teens. And then watching TV, pretty even, 34% of tweens and 30% of teens in this APA study reported watching TV to make themselves feel better. So it seems like a large number of our youth are learning early in life to rely on sedentary behaviors to manage stress. And this could, as you, I'm sure, surmise, have serious implications for the health of young Americans. And according to the data, CDC, and nearly 1 in 5 young people is obese, and I think this is a fairly, I'm not quite sure if that's has increased or not, or if that's about correct. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and tell me if that stat's about right.
Sorry, it took me a while to get to my unmuting.
That's okay.
I don't have stats in front of me, and it probably depends on what age group you're talking about, but from what I have heard, you hit a slight plateau of obesity where maybe the rate isn't going up as fast as it has been, but still far too many children are overweight or obese in all subsections in all areas of the country. I think that's pretty safe to say.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want. Thank you. So when we look then at impacts of chronic stress, we see that it impairs working memory, and so kids forget directions. They can't, juggle content in their head. They struggle to process even the simplest problems, and we're talking school settings here. In the larger arena regarding social skills, there's a loss of self-control. Young people have a tendency to misread others or not be able to read the social cues. And here's one impact of chronic stress. There's that unmitigated stress where there's unhealthy coping skills or lack of coping skills. And so young people are in this hyper-aroused state physiologically, and so that's what we're talking about when we talk about chronic stress. I don't want to infer that all stress is bad. Moderate stress is healthy, helps us perform. It will even help our memory to a certain degree. It helps our performance, and it even helps our ability to be creative. But when it gets goes beyond that ability to be able to cope and to handle it, and feelings of being overwhelmed, and that there's lack of adult support for young people to manage life stressors and help them be supported and soothed and learning healthy stress coping skills, that's when we get into the area of chronic stress. So, but when we look at habit changes, the impact of chronic stress on habit changes, that we need to think about what kinds of habits are we wanting students to change or improve or establish. Adriana Galvan at UCLA studied the effects of stress on teens and adults, and she found that teenagers experience stress as more stressful, and this interferes with their decision making. She looked at brain function, and teens who reported high levels of stress were examined by an MRI while doing a reward and risk video game involving wagering money. And teens show more activation in the reward system of the brain than adults do when making risky choices. And they are also making more risky choices than adults are. So we know that the prefrontal cortex is still developing and may develop all the way through age 28, as Daniel Siegel says at UCLA, and that's what helps regulate our behavior. So teens should kind of we need to double check and think about how the consequences will affect them later. So if stress interferes with how the brain functions in regions that are still developing, mainly the reward system and the prefrontal cortex system, I guess my question to you is a rhetorical one. What does that mean for wanting to change youth habits regarding eating? And is there some mental state that we need to pay attention to first before we can expect young people to make some healthy choices? And then, of course, definitely impairing decision-making. And those of you that are experts in nutrition and youth obesity, kids are making choices all the time, aren't they, about the kinds of foods. And adults, we want to impact that choice. When we look at some other data, this is data showing that the more risk factors that we have here, and those are risk factors of everything from family dysfunction, a family being intact, loss of family members, violence in the neighborhood, etc., abuse, neglect, trauma, the less ability of young people to delay their gratification. I mean, we all remember Dr. Walter Mischel's marshmallow test. And if you haven't heard it, I encourage you to Google it, marshmallow test, and see some fantastic videos of young kids trying to suppress their desire to eat that one marshmallow when the adult leaves the room, so that they, when the adult comes back and they haven't eaten that marshmallow, that they can get double the number of marshmallows. And we see kids doing all kinds of things from kind of looking around the room and humming to themselves, turning their back to the marshmallow, kind of just licking it and putting the marshmallow down, etc. And the outcome of this that Dr. Mischel found was that those young kids, and we're talking 4-, 5-year-olds, 3-, 4-, 5-year-old kids that he initially did this research on, ones that could manage their impulsivity and control for 15 minutes their desire to eat that marshmallow, did better on SAT scores and other markers of success. So we see that there's a relationship between risk factors, stress, and impulsivity. And so again, my question, to you is, how does that impact their decisions around healthy eating? Here's another study, showed some data from the American Psychological Association, their Stress in America study, and it compared young people and the ages here. There were 1,136 young people that were participating in this survey, ages 8 to 17. And what are you noticing? We have the overweight young person and their response to things like I worry versus the normal weighted young person. We look at weight, worry about their weight. We see 36 to 11, falling down to eating too much or too little. Hopefully you're seeing a pattern here, doing healthy things to make me feel better. When I'm worried or stressed, the normal weighted young person is doing 21% responded they're doing healthier things. Eat to feel better when stressed. And that's it's almost a 2-to-1 ratio there. There was a meta-analysis done of the weight status and anxiety in children and youth, children and adolescents, in the Journal of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics a year ago. And the study showed that there is a small association between weight status and anxiety. However, the caveat was that the methods of the studies that they examined weren't as strong as they could be as in research study and may modestly have influenced the effect between weight status and anxiety. And so the researchers concluded that we need to do more study in this area. We need to have some longitudinal studies. So when we look at some other research in this area, we see that there's a recommendation regarding stress reduction and mindful awareness components for a youth weight management approach. And Martin et al. Concluded that one component of an effective prevention and intervention for behavioral change points to stress reduction and mindful awareness. And when I speak about mindful awareness, it's the, I'll go into a little depth, a little bit more description about the definition, but it's being in the present moment with a sense of curiosity and not so much self-judgment. Also recommended stress reduction and mindful awareness may promote long-term weight management. That came out of the Journal of the American Medical Association. A study was done looking at the use of stress reduction and mindful awareness type practices in adolescent girls. They found a positive association between the level of perceived stress and their measures of general and abdominal obesity. And again, in this arena, school is definitely reported a source of adolescent stress and was recommended to be a focus of a stress management campaign. And finally, the research in general on mindfulness for youth and their well-being is an emerging area of research. For those of you interested, at the end of the presentation, I'll share with you our website where we did a type of research monograph on what is known right now about integrating mindfulness training into K-12 education, and I'll share what we're doing in a moment. When we're talking about what are stress management practices, well, there's a spectrum of these. Everything from teaching relaxation practices and recovering from stress triggers in non-stressful times, so things like diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, gratitude, definitely physical exercise, and we'll look at a couple more. It's important to teach young people to identify their stressors and what they can control and what they can't. And the California Department of Education's health curriculum framework, K-12, has definitely identified stress management as part of the curriculum. And unfortunately, so many of our schools today are not teaching health. And there's lots of aspects of health that are critical for young people, as you know, and stress management and mental health are just one of them. Teaching kids how to recognize and manage their emotions. Those are two areas called self-awareness and self-management, which are two domains of 5 of the social emotional learning set of competencies. The additional competencies are social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. And recognition of one's emotions, what triggers them, how that makes them feel, how that makes them think, recognizing accurately their sense of feelings is one area, as well as being able to manage those emotions, to regulate, to self-calm themselves, and to control their impulses. The other spectrum, the other practices on the spectrum are problem solving. Critical, and an example of this is, I always like to give, is in teenagers. Problem solving personal relationships. When we ask kids about their ability and their skill level in dealing with one another, getting along, many of them say, you know, the last time we had any social emotional skill teaching maybe was in 3rd grade with puppets. And they tell us our relationships are much more complicated now, and we need, you know, some help in kind of navigating this whole new area for many teens. And frankly, we see some mental health impacts such as depression, suicide ideation, even completed suicides around young people and you know, new relationships or breaking up of relationships. So problem-solving skills are critical. And then finally, what's called cognitive restructuring, really getting at how a young person is thinking about a situation, how they're thinking about their relationships, what kind of messages do they give themselves? Are they down on themselves? Are they negative? Are they self-critical? That's where I think this relatively new area of mindful self-compassion can come into play. And Dr. Kristen Neff, I believe she's at the University of Texas in Austin, has done some wonderful research in the area of self-compassion and has a program now for adults, but I'm seeing more self-compassion training, excuse me, in young people as well. So that, you know, we begin to address that negative self-talk that kids have, you know, have presented. So what are some of the effects of relaxation? Well, first of all, when I talk about relaxation, there are 2 critical attributes to elicit relaxation. You know, stress is automatic. We don't have to think about it. If, you know, we perceive a threat, if we perceive a situation that's beyond our control, if we perceive a situation where we can't cope with this adversity, the physical effects of the hormones pulsing through our body are going to happen. Relaxation, on the other hand, is voluntary. We have to stop and think about it and develop those good habits of becoming calm and focused and alert. And there are 2 critical attributes to relaxation. One is repetition, repeating of a physical movement, a word, a phrase, any kind of language You know, that's where a prayer, an exercise practice, breathing practice, anything repetitious. And the second critical attribute to elicit relaxation is neutral, non-judging mind. That's it. We can trigger the relaxation response through that. So that's why we focus so easily on deep diaphragmatic breathing. And then making sure that when we're doing that deep diaphragmatic breathing in a rhythmic way, that we're not putting ourselves down and we're just kind of in a neutral, curious mind. That will elicit the relaxation response. We don't have to be seated in any kind of yogic position. We don't even need to be in a quiet room. We can elicit the relaxation response in the middle of a crowd, in the middle of the airport, when we're on the phone, on hold, etc. So when we look at the effects, everything from reducing muscle tension, quieting the mind, improving the sleep, the concentration, here's that reduction of impulsivity, you know, thinking before we make food choices, helps with creative problem solving, and we've seen decreased anger and, excuse me, aggression as well. And then, of course, we're in the education business, so we always look at academic achievement, and that can be enhanced as well. And then thinking about habits, remember, if we're calmer and more centered, we're more able to work on changing behavior habits as well. And so what we're doing in Orange County that we started several years ago through funding from the California Mental Health Services Authority is we did a demonstration project which focused on stress management for young people. And our approach was start with the adults. Start with the teachers, the counselors, those youth-serving professionals, day in, day out, interacting with young people, focusing on their health and wellness first. This is a picture of I believe it's a fourth grade classroom in Anaheim, and we train teachers in our pilot project to first become healthy and resilient and have their own stress management practices, and then as authentic role models to integrate not a program but a set of tools into their daily classroom routines in few moments at a time, in a regular routine, stress reduction and mindful awareness practices. And it got to the point that the kids started realizing, you know, feeling different, and they started asking for these practices. And so the project really focuses on mental physical health. We want to reduce stress as a barrier to learning because we know that stress impacts many things in the body, but definitely the hippocampus, which is an area of memory, explicit memory, etc. We wanted to provide kids those healthy coping skills so they could self-regulate, self-manage, control those impulses, build that sense of resilience that they could adapt and bounce back to the adversity. So we taught relaxation and mindful awareness practices, few minutes a day into classroom routines, and we used a toolkit approach. And there are more and more practices out there, and on our website I'll point to you where you can see some of those programs that are doing research. But we wanted to go into the schools not with a program per se. We wanted to go in with, here's some tools in a variety of areas. You know your kids, you pick the tools that you want to use, and then observe and note their reactions. So we taught diaphragmatic breathing. If you want to go online, you can see a couple of videos of teachers doing this in the classroom. One of our teachers said, I've been using these breathing exercises every day, in my small reading groups. The first day they weren't able to sit still more than 30 seconds, and then she was amazed at their progress and their ability to get to a calm place. And now she finds that they can become more attentive and alert after their breathing practices. We teach progressive muscle relaxation. Boys have a tendency to relate to that a little bit. We see a little research in that area. And so we're teaching abdominal breathing. I mentioned the muscle relaxation, guided imagery. We could use the brain's ability to get to imagine a safe, comforting place, and the brain doesn't know that that's not a real place, but it will have a physiological reaction as if it is in that beautiful, lovely place. Gratitude, there's some excellent research that shows that those adults and young people, especially adults, there's a lot of research that if you keep a gratitude journal, 2 to 3 things a day, jot that down what you're grateful for, that you can become happier, you can stick to your exercise routines, and we beginning to see some research in this area with young people. Mindful awareness, I'm going to go a little deeper into that now. I'm watching my time. I think I have about 5 more minutes. What is mindfulness? We're hearing a lot about it. We see it in Time magazine. It's all over the place. Now we're seeing that corporations are using it. We're seeing that the military is teaching mindful awareness. The guru of mindfulness really is Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, University of Massachusetts in the 1970s. He brought this practice, and it's a secular practice that comes out of the Buddhist tradition, and it's really paying attention in a particular way. With on purpose, there's the intention, paying attention in the moment on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally, with an attitude of lack of self-criticism. And so how does mindfulness work? Well, it develops the prefrontal cortex, that ability, that place, and that ability to pause before we're acting on an impulse. And the prefrontal cortex is also the place sometimes called the executive function, where we rehearse, we concentrate, we make decisions, etc. So without mindfulness, there's the stimulus and then the reaction. But if we have a moment to pause, and that's what mindfulness helps us do, pause between that stimulus and response. Research has shown in adults, over 30 years of research, and new emerging research for young people, that allows for more self-regulation, empathy, better decision making. We're able to prioritize situations more. If you want to see, just Google Dr. Dan Siegel at UCLA School of Medicine. He's got some great videos that shows how the brain works and that mindfulness impacts that ability because of the prefrontal cortex to calm the emotional center of the brain, calm the limbic system, calm the stress response. So here's a few samples of emerging research on mindfulness in, I think this is young people. This is research in young people, that it impacts their sense of well-being, their ability to attend, and improves their behavior in elementary school and adolescence. Definitely, we're even doing some of this research in early childhood, so a child is able to regulate their emotions, self-calm, even some impacts on optimism, emotional stability in pre- and adolescent students, reduction in anxiety symptoms or attention lacking symptoms in 9 to 13-year-olds, as well as attention in first, second, and third graders, increased feelings of calm, self-acceptance in adolescent girls, and then positively, mindfulness positively associated in particular studies regarding executive function, that ability again to inhibit impulsivity. So this is the mindfulness research monograph that we put together, an intern, Cal State Long Beach University intern and there's the information if you want to go a little bit deeper and see some of the research on that. And the practices that we encourage adults to do, first of all, is practice stillness and calming techniques first before you teach students. Identify your role as a co-learner and guide. This is invitational work. You can't force young people, can't force anyone basically to relax. You must relax. That's not how this work goes. You invite individuals to participate. And kids learn best when they're actively doing these practices and not being told to calm down. But that's my 30-minute thing. And regular practice creates a routine, and we encourage adults to start simply. And then to identify how school can be a stressor. And that's kind of like a whole other presentation. But I want to wind down right now and point to our website where you can get a little bit more information. And so I hope that I've kind of stimulated some questions and some thinking around what could be a whole child approach to thinking about impacting a child's eating habits and their impulsivity around this. And if we draw the curtain back to see what's behind these behaviors that are harming kids, that they're doing that are not healthy for themselves, are there some other skills that we need to provide young people to help make healthier food choices? So thanks so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
Thanks so much, Lucy. We appreciate the presentation. We're asking the work group now if they have any questions.
My main question would be, can you define what chronic stress types of stressors are being cataloged in some of the research versus what moderate stress might look like, so that we can start thinking a little bit more clearly about or envisioning what chronic stress looks like and who the populations that are being researched are.
If I understand the question correctly, you're asking kind of how do we identify chronic versus moderate stress, or that unmitigated stress. Is that correct?
Yes, and the secondary question would be, who are these populations that are being researched, and what types what types of chronic stress are those students actually experiencing?
Well, let me try to answer the first question first. The difference, as the Harvard graduate school group called, let's see, I think the name of it is something like Healthy Development of Youth, has identified what's positive stress, tolerable stress, and chronic stress. And the difference between the two, positive stress, is those short-term daily life things. You know, you're going to go to the doctors, something new is happening in your life, et cetera. And if you have an adult support, then that's healthy. Then you can learn to kind of manage those kinds of stressors. tolerable stress, maybe loss of a loved one or a situation that is still short-lived, maybe a disaster, etc. If you have strong adult support, tolerable stress can turn into, again, an experience of growth that's healthy. But chronic or toxic stress, as they define it, are long-term, ongoing, unmitigated issues like abuse, like neglect, and even sometimes with positive, adult support, young people are not able to manage those helpfully, and if those go on long periods of time, we know that it has impacts on their health, their cognition, even their brain development. So getting back to how do you identify the difference, basically is it's not that easy to differentiate stress from some other types of issues, but one thing is a marker for us, and that is if a child's behavior has changed from what is usually normal for that child. That's one indicator. We're observing, the hygiene of a kid has changed. All of a sudden, they're dropping in grades. And, it could be stress and anxiety and could be other kind of emotional health issues as well. And I'm not sure which studies you're referring to regarding populations, but studies around stress have been done with pretty much a whole range of populations, everything from inner city urban kids. You'll see in that monograph with some of the programs that are being done in inner city schools and affluent neighborhoods with different ethnicities. We're seeing studies being done with all of those different groups.
Thanks so much, Lucy. We're actually going to have to cut the questions off because we have some other items on our meeting agenda for today. But would you mind if we provided the work group partners with your email address? If they had any follow-up questions, they could email you directly?
That'd be great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and appreciate all the good work that you all do for young people.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Awesome. Thanks, Dana.
Yeah.
Every year we revisit